Did someone say manifest destiny? 8-year-old Enrique Esparza was sleeping in a small room in the church at the Alamo. He was jolted awake by a blast of gunfire. It was so dark that we couldn't see anything, he remembered. Gregorio, the soldiers have jumped the wall, Enrique's mother said to his father. The fight's begun. Enrique watched his father get up, grab his gun, and run out to join the battle. I never saw him again, Enrique said. Remember the Alamo. Enrique and his mother, and about 15 other women and children, huddled in the corners of the room as the battle for the Alamo grew louder. We could hear the Mexican officers shouting to the men, Enrique said, and the men were fighting so close that we could hear them strike each other. Susanna Dickinson was in a nearby room clutching her baby daughter, wondering how the fight was going. The struggle lasted more than 2 hours when my husband rushed into the church where I was with my child, she said. Great God, Sue, the Mexicans are inside our walls, shouted Almiron Dickinson. All is lost. If they spare you, save my child. Almiron was right. All was lost. By 6:30 that morning, the badly outnumbered Texans were forced to surrender. Santa Anna's soldiers killed all 183 Texas soldiers, stabbing many of them with bayonets after they had surrendered. Later that March, Mexican soldiers defeated another small American army near the town of Goliad, Texas. About 400 Americans were taken prisoner. Following Santa Anna's orders, Mexican soldiers marched the prisoners to an open field, shot and bayoneted all of them, and set the bodies on fire. Enraged Texans promised payback. As one young soldier in the Texas Army explained, the boys were continually talking about the butchery at the Alamo and the slaughter at Goliad, and vowing to avenge the cold-blooded murder of their countrymen. Revenge at San Jacinto. The job of getting revenge belonged to the volunteers of the Texas Army, about 800 men under the command of Sam Houston. Some doubted that Houston was the right man for the job. While serving as governor of Tennessee a few years back, he had quit suddenly, refusing to give a reason. He had gone to live with the Cherokees, who soon nicknamed him Big Drunk. He was 6'2" and often drunk. On the plus side, Houston had the ability to remain cool under pressure, and he had a good plan. He began retreating east across Texas, forcing Santa Anna's larger army to chase him 200 miles. All the while, he watched and waited for the perfect moment to turn and strike. Houston saw his opportunity near the San Jacinto River on April 21st, 1836. Let us fight fast and hard, he told his men. We must win or die. The Texans charged forward, shouting, Remember the Alamo! Remember Goliad! The attack surprised the entire Mexican army, especially its commander. I was in a deep sleep when I was awakened by the firing and noise, confessed Santa Anna. He jumped up from his nap, put on his red slippers, stepped out of his tent, and immediately burst into a panic. I saw His Excellency running about in the most utmost excitement, wringing his hands and unable to give an order, recalled a Mexican officer. The Texans won the battle in just 18 minutes, and they did remember the Alamo and Goliad. Maybe too well. It took Houston's officers a while to get the Texans to stop killing Mexican soldiers. When it was all over, nearly 600 Mexicans were dead, compared with only 9 Texans. Texas soldiers caught Santa Anna. He was trying to escape, disguised as a Mexican private, and the Mexican leader agreed to pull his troops out of Texas. So that was that. Texas had its independence. Some Texans were hoping to join the United States, but for now, Texas was an independent country. We'll keep an eye on that situation. Meanwhile, since we're speaking of land that was not yet part of the United States, honeymoon in Oregon. It was a busy week for Narcissa Prentice. This young school teacher from a small New York town got married on February 18, 1836. The next day, she and her husband, Marcus Whitman, set out for their new home in the Oregon country, on the other side of the continent. The Oregon country, the area that now makes up Oregon, Washington, and Idaho, was a huge section of land claimed by both Great Britain and the United States. Both basically said, I saw it first, but aside from a few mountain men, no one from Britain or the United States was actually living there. The Whitmans were about to help change that. Their plan was to settle in Oregon and work as missionaries, teaching Christianity to the Walla Walla, Spokane, Nez Perce, and other Native Americans of the region. In her journal, Narcissa called the trip to Oregon an unheard-of journey for females. She was right. No American woman had ever made this 2,400-mile trek across the Great Plains and over the Rocky Mountains. As if it were not going to be difficult enough, Narcissa found out at the last second that she and her husband would be traveling with two other missionaries, Henry Spalding and his new wife, Eliza. Henry had asked Narcissa to marry him a few years before, and she had turned him down. He was still bitter about it. So Narcissa knew there would be some awkward moments as the two couples shared a tent for months on their way west. Luckily, the challenges of the trip kept everyone pretty busy. Buzzing clouds of mosquitoes and fleas surrounded the couples as their wagons bounced across the plains. There were no trees, which meant no shade from the burning sun and no wood to make fires. In a letter to her sister, Harriet, and brother Edward, Narcissa explained how they managed to cook. Our fuel for cooking has been dried buffalo dung. We now find plenty of it, and it answers a very good purpose, similar to the kind of coal used in Pennsylvania. I suppose Harriet will make a face at this, but if she was here, she would be glad to have her supper cooked at any rate. Their food was mainly buffalo meat, which everyone got sick of after a few weeks. I thought of mother's bread and butter many times, Narcissa wrote. The only real dangerous moment came when Eliza's horse took a wrong step. Yesterday my horse became unmanageable in consequence of stepping into a hornet's nest, Eliza explained. She was thrown from the horse, but that wasn't the worst part. My foot remained a moment in the stirrup, and my body dragged some distance, she said. You had to be tough to cross the continent, and Eliza obviously was. She was back on the trail the next day. After 6 long months of traveling, the Whitmans and Spaldings reached the Oregon country. We'll check back with them later. For now, the important thing to know is that their journey helped show Americans that women and families could travel safely to Oregon. The route they had taken became known as the Oregon Trail, and over the next few years, thousands of families set out on the trail hoping to claim a piece of rich Oregon farmland. Manifest Destiny Declared. By 1840, Americans knew about the Rocky Mountains from mountain men and had heard all about New Mexico from traveling merchants. Settlers in Texas and Oregon sent back letters describing land that was fertile and cheap. Many Americans began to think, wouldn't it be nice if all that land were ours? Lots of them believed it should be. Some were convinced that God wanted it that way, that it was God's plan to have the American style of democracy spread across the continent to the Pacific Ocean. This idea was summed up by the journalist John O'Sullivan. The American claim is by the right of our manifest destiny to overspread and to possess the whole of the continent which Providence has given us for the development of the great experiment of liberty. The phrase manifest destiny soon became famous. Manifest means clear to see or obvious. O'Sullivan was saying that it was clearly the destiny of the United States to spread from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Was he right? James K. Polk thought so. Who is James K. Polk? When the leaders of the Democratic Party met to choose a presidential candidate in 1844, they couldn't agree on anyone they really liked, so they decided to compromise on someone they sort of liked, a former Tennessee governor named James K. Polk. The leaders of the Whig Party, the other major political party in the United States at the time, were thrilled to be running against this guy. The Whigs' campaign motto was, "Who is James K. Polk?" He may not have been too famous, but Polk was very clear about what he would do if elected. A strong believer in manifest destiny, Polk insisted that the United States should immediately annex Texas, make it part of the United States, in other words. Then, he said, we should force Great Britain to give up its claims to Oregon. Then we'll buy the rest of the West from Mexico. These popular ideas helped Polk win a close election. At 49, he was the youngest president to be elected up to that point. He took over as president in March 1845, getting right to work on his plans to expand the United States. In fact, he worked so quickly that in just a few days, he nearly started 2 wars. First, the United States annexed Texas, which brought cheers from Texans and howls of anger from the Mexican capital. Many Mexicans still thought of Texas as part of their country, and they considered the American annexation a cause for war. British leaders, meanwhile, refused Polk's demands that they give up claims to Oregon. The British government started making threats and preparing to fight. Polk's reply? He was ready to fight both countries at once. Exploring with the blockheads. But even the threat of war didn't stop Americans from heading west. If it was the United States' manifest destiny to own the West, American leaders figured they might as well find out what was there. Up to that point, there were no accurate maps of most of the West. The powerful Senator Thomas Hunt the powerful Senator Thomas Hart Benton gave the job of making new maps to a young man named John Fremont, whose main qualification for mapping the West was that he was Benton's son-in-law. Fremont put together a team of explorers, including a German mapmaker named Charles Preuss. Preuss was not what you would call an outdoorsman. The moment the crew set out from St. Louis, he began whining about the aches in his body from riding on horses and sleeping on hard ground. Some of his early journal entries tell of other complaints. Weather good, food bad. I wish I were in Washington with my old girl. I wish I had a drink. When the men killed an ox for food, Preuss wrote these entries in his journal. June 12th. Some of the men tried to eat the liver now. I was satisfied with bread and coffee. I am not yet so hungry that I would gulp down very fresh meat, which is repulsive to me. Tomorrow, to be sure, it will taste excellent. June 13th. It did not taste excellent. And speaking of food, Preuss noted, when they did get some decent meat, the cook always ruined it. That fool had packed neither sugar nor salt nor pepper, wrote Preuss. What good is the best foodstuff if one cannot prepare it properly? As they headed farther west that summer, it got unbearably hot and buggy. Then there were endless and exhausting climbs into the Rocky Mountains. No supper, no breakfast, little or no sleep, Preuss wrote. Who can enjoy climbing a mountain under these circumstances? He was particularly annoyed that Fremont kept stopping to collect samples of rocks and plants. That fellow knows nothing about mineralogy or botany, wrote Preuss, yet he collects every trifle. Let him collect as much as he wants, if he would only not make us wait for our meal. Oh, you American blockheads! Preuss's only kind words were for a small group of Indians who saved him when he got lost in the desert and was dying of hunger. I walked straight up to them, sat down among them, and gave them to understand that I was hungry, he wrote. They immediately served me acorns, some of which I ate, and others I put in my pockets. When they saw this, they themselves filled both my pockets. He may have been miserable, but Preuss was a very good mapmaker, and he needed the job to support his family. Suffering through 3 long journeys across the West in the 1840s, Preuss produced the most accurate maps yet of the region. The maps were published along with Fremont's journals, which Fremont's wife, Jessie, rewrote for him when he got home. These maps and journals became huge bestsellers. They got Americans even more interested in all that land to the west. Oregon fever rages. The idea of moving to Oregon was especially exciting. The Oregon fever is raging in almost every part of the Union, reported one newspaper. It was hard for Easterners to resist the fever when they heard tales of Oregon's mild climate and fertile soil. One farmer listened to a land promoter trying to persuade people to move to Oregon. They do say, gentlemen, they do say that out in Oregon the pigs are running around about under the great acorn trees, round and fat, and already cooked, with knives and forks sticking in them so that you can cut off a slice whenever you are hungry. No one really believed that, let's hope, but thousands of families were convinced that they could build a better life in Oregon. Actually, by reading diaries from that time, we see that it was almost always the husbands who made the decision to move west. Wives were often more reluctant to leave their friends and family behind, knowing they would probably never see each other again. Dr. Wilson has determined to go, wrote a young woman named Margaret Wilson. I am going with him, as there is no other alternative. Once the decision was made, the next step was to pack up a wagon and head to Missouri, where the Oregon Trail began. There you could stock up on important supplies like flour, bacon, sugar, coffee, and barrels of water. And you could team up with other families and hire a guide, usually an out-of-work mountain man. Mountain men had killed off most of the beavers in the West, but now they found new careers guiding families along the Oregon Trail. Are we there yet? Even with an expert guide, this was an exhausting and dangerous 2,400-mile trip. Dragged forward by oxen, wagons rocked along at a top speed of 2 miles per hour. Men kept busy herding the family's farm animals, repairing the wagons, and hunting for dinner. Women worked even harder, getting up at 4 a.m. to start breakfast, then working all day and late into the night, cooking, cleaning, washing and mending clothes, taking care of young children. Bigger kids walked alongside the wagon, lightening the load a little for the poor oxen. As they walked, children had the key job of collecting buffalo chips, which were used for cooking fuel. The chips burned quickly, so they had to gather huge piles of them for every meal. Once they were out on what seemed like the endless Great Plains, many families started wishing they had packed a bit lighter. They wondered, do we really need this heavy kitchen table? Wouldn't we move a bit faster without these extra chairs? Desperate to speed up their journey, they started tossing stuff out the backs of their wagons, littering the road to Oregon with a trail of furniture, mirrors, tools, stoves, beds, and clothing. Aside from simply being sick of traveling, families had another reason for wanting to move quickly. During the entire trip, Indians were a source of anxiety, we being never sure of their friendship, explained one traveler. It was a relief to discover that Native Americans were much more interested in trading with travelers than attacking them. The two main causes of death for early Oregon Trail travelers might surprise you. Number 1, gun accidents. Number 2, drowning while trying to cross rivers. As more and more travelers crowded the trail, a new problem became clear to both eyes and noses. The route was dotted with countless mounds of human waste. The stench is sometimes almost unendurable, said a traveler named Charlotte Pengra. These stinky piles polluted water supplies, helping to spread deadly diseases. Disease soon became the deadliest danger on the Oregon Trail. Just ask Catherine Sager.